I never thought I'd be the man who fell for his ex-girlfriend's mother. I'm 22. I build furniture for a living, and I'd spent 2 years telling myself the quiet life was all I needed. Then her mother found me at the back of a gallery opening, leaned in close, and asked me to take her somewhere private. I thought she was about to tell me I'd done something wrong. What she actually confessed changed how I understood loneliness and how close I came to walking away from the only good thing left in my life. My name is Daniel, and I make my living shaping wood into things people keep. I run a one-man shop outside a small river town, the kind of place where the morning fog sits on the water until almost 9, and the neighbors wave without expecting you to stop. My house is a faded farmhouse with a workshop out back, and most days I don't speak to another human being until I drive into town for coffee at 2. The divorce took the noise out of my life 2 years ago. Somewhere along the way, I started calling the silence peaceful instead of what it really was, and it was empty, and I had gotten good at not noticing. The marriage had ended the way a long drought ends a river, not in one flood, but in a slow falling of the water until the rocks showed. My ex-wife was a good woman who'd married a quiet man, and then spent 12 years waiting for him to come up for air. She told me, the last night, that living with me felt like living beside a deep lake, calm to look at and cold to touch. I didn't argue. Some of it was true enough that fighting it would have been a lie, and she'd earned the right to her own version of our years. After she left, I rebuilt my days around the silence, like a man shoring up a wall, telling myself that if I kept busy enough with my hands, the rest of me wouldn't notice what was missing. I wake before light, drink my coffee standing at the bench, and let my hands decide what the day will be. They're scarred from 20 years of blades and splinters, a pale ridge across the left thumb where the chisel slipped one winter. Calluses thick enough that I can sand a rough edge and barely feel it. Those hands are the one part of myself I trust without question, because they've never lied to me about what they can do. The rest of me I'm less sure of, but the hands know their work, and most mornings, that's enough to get me out of bed. I had a habit back then that I didn't think about until much later. When something broke, I never threw it out. The hinge got fixed, the chair leg glued, the clock reset instead of buying new. It wasn't about money. The belief underneath was simpler, that a thing worth keeping is worth the slow work of repair, even when repairing it takes longer than starting over would. I tell you this now because it's the only way the rest of the story makes sense. How I looked at a broken bench and a lonely woman and saw the same kind of project. There were small signs I ignored, the way you ignore a draft under a door until winter comes. I kept 2 coffee mugs on the shelf, even though only one ever got used. I'd set a chair at the kitchen table and then sit across from it like I was waiting for someone who'd stopped coming years ago. The phone stayed dark after 9 most nights, and I told myself that was rest, that a man my age had earned the right to a quiet evening. Looking back, I think I was just practicing being alone until I got so good at it that I forgot there was any other way to live. The woman I used to date is named Charlotte, and we were together for almost a year before we ended it, about 6 months before this story starts. She was 30, bright, the kind of person who walked into a room and made it feel fuller just by being there. I liked that about her at first, how she filled the silences I'd gotten used to, living inside. After a while, the same thing that drew me in started to wear on us both, because she wanted more noise and more people and a bigger life, and I wanted the porch and the quiet and the work. We didn't fight like couples fight in the stories. We sat at my kitchen table one Sunday and admitted, gently, that we didn't fit. She said she'd been trying to get me to open up for months, and I said I'd been trying to feel the things she needed me to feel, and we'd both been failing at it. There were no hard feelings, or at least none we let show. At the door we hugged, and she drove off, and I went back to my bench and told myself it was for the best. There's one evening I keep coming back to, about 3 months before we ended. She dragged me to a friend's birthday dinner, A long table of loud people I didn't know. And halfway through the meal, she reached under the table and squeezed my hand because she could see I was drowning in the noise. She held on for the rest of the dinner. I let her. I think that was the closest we ever came to understanding each other. Two people reaching across a distance that looked small, but wasn't. She was trying to pull me out, and I was trying to let her, and we were both too tired to admit it wasn't working. I remembered her mostly in small flashes after that. The way she laughed too loud at parties when she'd had one glass of wine, like she was performing a version of happiness for the room. How she'd pull her hair over one shoulder when she was thinking hard about something, and how she'd look at me across a crowded table, as if checking whether I was still in there. She was kind. She deserved someone who met her where she lived, instead of asking her to come down into my quiet. So when she called me about the cabinets, I almost said no. Her mother was reopening a small gallery in town and needed custom display cabinets built. And Charlotte had told her I was the right man for it, because there were no hard feelings between us. My pride wouldn't let me sound like a man who was afraid of a phone call, so I took the job. I told myself it was just work, and that I'd deliver the pieces, collect the check, and never think about that family again. I'd only met her mother a handful of times during the year I dated Charlotte, and she was a distant, elegant presence at the edges of things, always a little apart from the room, watching more than she joined in. Black hair, going silver, at the temples, a soft voice, and eyes that carried something I couldn't name then, but recognized now as loneliness. I hadn't thought about her much. She was Charlotte's mother, a background figure, and I had filed her under the parts of that year that didn't belong to me. The opening was on a Friday evening in early fall, and I almost didn't go. Delivering the cabinets had been the job, and the job was done. But Evelyn had left a handwritten note on the last crate asking me to come see them in the light, because she said a piece of furniture only became itself when it held something beautiful. I'm a man who takes pride in his work, so I put on a clean shirt and drove into town, telling myself I'd stay 20 minutes and slip out the back. The gallery glowed warm and low, the kind of lighting that makes everything look like a memory even while it's still happening. People moved through the rooms in nice clothes with glasses in their hands, and soft music came from somewhere I couldn't see. I stood near the wall where my cabinets held a row of handmade bowls, and I watched strangers run their fingers along the joints I'd cut. It felt strange. My work was out in the world like that, dressed up and on display. When I usually sold it from the dust of my shop, Charlotte found me first. She came over bright and social, kissed my cheek, and told me the cabinets were the best thing in the room. She was gone again almost before I could answer, pulled back into the current of her friends, and I was glad. The awkwardness I'd braced for never landed, and what was left was just a quiet gratitude that we'd managed to end things without ruining each other. Then her mother crossed the room toward me, and the evening turned into something else entirely. Evelyn wore a simple black dress and her black hair pinned up, and she moved through the crowd the way smoke moves, unhurried and apart. Up close, I could see the tiredness her smile was working to cover, a thin strain around her eyes that I'd missed before, because I'd never looked at her long enough to see it. She thanked me for the cabinets, and she said they were the finest things in the room, and then she held my gaze a beat longer. Then a polite thank you requires. She leaned in close, and I felt the warmth of her shoulder near mine, and she whispered, "Take me somewhere private." My heart dropped into my stomach. I was certain I'd done something wrong, that a cabinet was crooked, that I'd offended her somehow, that this was the moment a quiet man dreads where someone finally tells him he's messed up. She didn't explain. She just turned and led me through a curtain at the back of the room, and I followed her, because my legs decided before my head could catch up. The back office was small and dim, lit by one lamp on a cluttered desk, and it smelled of old wood and tea and something faintly floral, like a sachet tucked into a drawer. She closed the door behind us, and the noise of the gallery dropped away all at once. It was just the two of us standing in that quiet, warm room, with the muffled sound of the party on the other side of the curtain. She didn't start right away. She stood with her back against the closed door for a moment, gathering herself, and I understood that whatever she was about to say had been held in for a long time. Then she told me carefully, like someone setting down something fragile, that she had been alone since her husband died 4 years ago. Not just alone in the way widows say they're alone, the kind people nod at and then forget. Alone in a way that had thinned her down to almost nothing, until some days she wondered if she was still really there. She said the worst part wasn't the grief, because grief at least proves someone mattered. The worst part was becoming invisible. While she was still breathing, Charlotte was busy with her own life and loved her, but she saw her as a role, as mom, and not as a woman with her own hours to fill, and her own hunger to be known. The friends who had crowded the kitchen after the funeral stopped calling after the first year. The way water drains from a crack in the ground, slowly, and then all at once, until one day she realized the phone hadn't rung in a week, and no one had noticed her noticing. Her house had grown too quiet for one person. She said she'd started leaving the radio on in empty rooms, just so the walls would give her back a voice that wasn't her own. She cooked dinners meant for a family and ate them alone at the counter. And she'd stopped setting the table because the second place setting made the silence louder instead of less. And then she said the thing that cracked the whole story open. She told me I was the first person in years who had looked at her like she was still a woman, and not just a widow or someone's mother. She'd seen it in how I talked to her about the cabinets, asking what she wanted to display, and how the light fell, and what felt right to her eye as if her taste still mattered. People her age had stopped asking her what she wanted a long time ago, and she'd started to believe she didn't want anything anymore, and then I had made her remember that she did. I stood there with my chest tight, feeling 3 things at once that didn't fit together. There was tenderness, sharp and sudden, for this woman who had been disappearing in plain sight. There was guilt, because I'd known her a whole year and never once looked closely enough to see her going under. And there was a pull toward her that alarmed me, because she was Charlotte's mother, and the math of that was supposed to close the door before I even got to the feeling. She caught herself then. Her fingers went to her mouth like she'd said too much, and her composure came back up in a rush, and she told me she shouldn't have said any of it. She said she just needed one person to know, and that I could forget the whole conversation, and that it wouldn't change anything between us, about the cabinets, or anything else. Her hand was already reaching for the door handle when I stopped her. I told her, softly, that I wasn't going to forget it. And I told her I'd been alone too, in my own quieter way, and that I knew what she meant about the silence getting so loud. It starts to feel like a person living in the house. With you. I said I was glad she'd told me, even though I didn't yet understand why I was glad, only that the air in that little room had changed and neither of us was invisible to the other anymore. Before we left that back room, she asked me for one more thing, and I think we both understood it was a reason to see each other again. Her late husband had kept an old garden bench under the oak in the backyard, a wooden bench he'd built himself the year they married, and it was rotting apart now, but she couldn't bring herself to let it go. She asked if I would rebuild it, keep the bones of it, but make it sound again, and she offered to pay me for the work. I told her I'd come look at it. We'd figure out the money later, and her shoulders dropping a half-inch told me the bench had never really been about the bench. The first time I drove out to her house, I understood more about her in 10 minutes than I had in a year of passing her at the edges of Charlotte's life. Her place was a little too big for one person. A tidy white house with a porch that wrapped around one side, and the garden had gone half wild the way gardens do when the person who tended them is tired. The bench sagged under the old oak. One leg was buckled, 2 slats split down the grain, the wood gone silver with weather. Her husband's presence was everywhere, but it wasn't haunting, it was heavy, in a gentle way. His reading glasses sat on a side table by the door, and a coat hung on a hook, like he might reach for it any minute. And his tools lined the wall of the garden shed in the order he'd left them. She hadn't erased him, and I was glad of that. A woman who keeps the glasses on the table is a woman who knows how to love something even after it's gone, and that told me more about her heart than anything she'd said in the back room. We worked side by side that first afternoon. I measured and pried up the broken slats, and she handed me tools before I asked for them, learning the rhythm of my hands like you learn a song. She brought out lemonade without being asked, and she'd made it unsweetened. And when I looked up, surprised, she just shrugged and said she remembered I took my coffee black, so she guessed I didn't like things too sweet. It was such a small thing. It landed in me like a stone in still water, because nobody had remembered how I took anything. In a very long time, I noticed she was different here than she'd been at the gallery. Softer and funnier, with a dry humor that snuck up on you, and younger in her eyes than the woman in the black dress. I noticed something else, too, that I was talking more than I had in months, telling her about the grain of the wood and how a good joint should sound when it seats. And she listened like the details mattered. By the time I packed up my tools that day, I'd said more words to her in one afternoon than I'd said to anyone in a week. When I pried off the worst broken slat, the one split clean down the grain, I slipped it into my jacket pocket, instead of throwing it on the scrap pile, without stopping to examine why. I just kept it. A man keeps a thing like that when it means something he's not ready to name. The visits became regular after that, 2 afternoons a week, sometimes 3, and I stopped pretending to myself that the bench was the reason I drove out there. The slow burn built the way a fire builds when you keep feeding it small sticks. Not a blaze, but a steady warmth that you don't notice until you step away and feel the cold. Small gestures piled up, one on top of the next, until they formed a language we were speaking without admitting it. She left the back gate unlocked for me on work days, and that unlocked gate meant more to me than any invitation could have. I sanded down a splintered edge on her porch railing without being asked, because I couldn't stand the thought of her catching her hand on it. She told me about her husband, the good years and the lonely ones at the end when he was sick, and I told her about the divorce, and how my ex-wife had finally said she felt like she was married to a piece of furniture. We traded the hard parts of our lives like people trade secrets, a little at a time, each one a door opening onto the next. There was one rainy afternoon when we couldn't work, so we sat on the porch instead with coffee and watched the storm move across the garden. We said nothing for a long stretch, and it should have been awkward. 2 people sitting in silence who barely knew each other, but it wasn't. It was the first time I understood that the silence with her was a different animal from the silence I lived in alone. The silence alone was an absence, a hole shaped like a life. The silence with her was full, the way a room is full when someone you trust is sitting in the next chair, and I carried that distinction home with me and turned it over for days. The trouble was that the more I felt, the more I noticed I was feeling, and noticing made me pull back. I'd catch myself watching her hands as she held a board steady, or her black hair falling loose against her neck when she bent over the bench, or her laughing at her own jokes before the punchline even landed. Each time I jerked my attention back to the wood and tell myself it was just friendliness, just 2 people getting along, nothing that crossed any line. She felt it too, and it scared her as much as it scared me, because one visit, she turned cool and almost distant, busy with small tasks that kept her across the yard from me. I drove home that night, sure. I'd imagined the whole thing. Sure, I'd embarrassed us both by looking too long. The next time I came, she apologized before I'd even set my toolbox down. She said she didn't want to make me uncomfortable, and that she'd gotten frightened of how much she looked forward to my days, and that she'd rather have me as a careful friend than risk losing me by wanting more. I told her she hadn't made me uncomfortable, and I almost told her the truth. That the fright was mine too, but I held it. The line between us was the kind that once crossed can't be uncrossed, and I wasn't yet sure I had the right to cross it. The turn came on an evening in late fall when a storm rolled in, faster than the forecast had promised. I was under the oak, measuring a replacement slat, when the sky went the color of a bruise, and the power went out across the whole street, all at once like someone pulled a plug. We stumbled onto the porch with candles and a lantern, and the rain came down so hard the garden disappeared behind a wall of water. There was nothing to do but sit and wait it out. We couldn't work, and for the first time, we couldn't pretend. The bench was the reason I was there. The candlelight made the porch feel smaller and closer, and the dark stripped away the careful distance we'd been keeping, the way a low tide strips away the sand and shows what's actually underneath. She spoke first, and her voice was quieter than the rain. She told me she'd almost canceled me that day because she was scared of how much she looked forward to my afternoons and how that looking forward had become the bright spot in a week that was otherwise the same shade of gray. And she knew how it sounded. A woman her age, counting the days until a man came to fix her bench, and she was ashamed of needing it as much as she did. I answered her with the thing I'd been hiding for weeks. I told her I drove past her street on the days I wasn't scheduled to come, and that every time I had to make myself keep driving instead of turning in. And that some days I lost that fight and circled the block twice before I went home. What I'd been telling myself was that it was habit, the route I'd gotten used to, but we both knew that was a lie. I told so I wouldn't have to say the real word. She reached over and put her hand on mine on the scarred one, and she traced the ridge across my thumb with her fingertip, slowly, like she was reading something written there. I turned my palm up so that I was holding her hand. We sat like that without speaking, while the rain hammered the roof and the candles threw our shadows long across the porch floor. I leaned toward her, and she closed her eyes, and I could feel the whole story tipping toward the place there was no coming back from. And then I stopped myself. I pulled back, just a little, and I told her I couldn't, not yet, not until I was sure I wasn't just lonely and reaching for the nearest warm person, because she deserved more than that. She deserved someone who chose her on purpose, not just because the quiet had gotten too loud. It was the gentlest refusal I could manage, and it hurt us both in a way I wasn't expecting. She opened her eyes, and she nodded. And she thanked me for meaning it, because she said she'd spent enough years being wanted for the wrong reasons to know the difference. She walked me to the door and held my hand one more second at the threshold, and then she let go. I drove home through the storm with my right hand still warm from hers, and I didn't turn the radio on, because for the first time in years the quiet in the truck didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like the space where a decision was going to be made. I stayed away for 9 days after that, and each one felt longer than the one before it. I threw myself into a commission for a dining table, working late into the nights, letting the sawdust and the noise fill the space where her afternoons had been. The broken slat from her bench sat on my workbench where I could see it. More than once I caught myself holding it and running my thumb along its weathered grain, the way she'd run her finger along my scar. I tried to argue myself out of her. That's what a man does with a case he's already lost. I told myself the town would talk, because small towns talk most about the things that look strange from the outside, and a man dating his ex-girlfriend's mother would look plenty strange. Then there was the fact that she was older than me, and that the men down at the lumberyard would grin and say things I'd have to live with, and that Charlotte would look at me with a face I already knew too well, the quiet face she made right before she decided something was finished. I told myself I was protecting Evelyn by staying away, that a man who cared about her wouldn't drag her into the kind of talk that follows a woman more than it follows a man. It was a clean, noble story, and I almost believed it the way you almost believe anything that lets you off the hook of being brave. I knew it was a lie, even as I built it. Protecting her was the story I told, so I wouldn't have to admit the simpler, uglier truth that I was protecting myself from wanting something again after I'd already failed at it once. A man who's been broken open learns to keep his hands in his pockets, and mine had been in my pockets for 2 years, and reaching for her felt like uncurling fingers that had frozen in that position. The world started closing in before I'd even made a choice. I was at the hardware store buying screws when a man I know by sight leaned over the counter and said he'd noticed my truck out at Evelyn's place a lot lately, with that half smile people use when they think they figured you out. I deflected, said I was doing some woodworking for her, and he nodded slow like he'd heard exactly what he expected to hear. My stomach dropped. After I paid for the screws, I walked out, and I could feel the watching already starting, the quiet attention of a town that had nothing much to do but notice. By the 8th day, I had almost talked myself all the way out. I sat at my kitchen table across from that empty chair, and I told myself that a man my age should know better than to reach for something he couldn't have cleanly, and that the kind thing to do was let the bench stay broken and let her go back to being a face at the edge of a life I didn't belong in. Then I checked my mailbox and found a note from her, slipped between the bills in her careful handwriting. It said the bench was fine without me, but she wasn't, and that I should come when I wanted to, or not come at all, and that she'd understand either way, because she'd had enough practice understanding. I went back the next morning. I told myself I was going to finish the bench and nothing more, but my hands were already steadier than they'd been in 9 days, the way a man's hands settle when he stopped fighting the thing he's been fighting. She was on the porch waiting, and she didn't say anything grand when I walked up. She just handed me a cup of coffee and pointed at the oak, and we got to work like no time had passed at all. For the first hour, it felt possible. The bench was nearly done, just 2 slats left to fit, and the air between us was lighter than it had been since the storm. Easy in the way things are easy when 2 people have stopped pretending. She made a joke about my measuring twice and cutting once, and I laughed in a way that surprised me because the sound had gotten unfamiliar in my own mouth. For that hour, I let myself believe that we could have this, a quiet closeness, 2 people who'd found each other late, and that maybe the world would let us keep it. Then a truck pulled into the driveway, and the hour ended. It was Charlotte. She'd said she'd drop by to see her mother sometime that week, and she hadn't known I'd be there. And I could see the moment she put the pieces together as she climbed down from the cab. She saw the bench, rebuilt and almost finished, and she saw me standing in the garden with a sanding block in my hand. And she saw her mother on the porch in a way that suddenly looked like more than a woman overseeing a carpentry job. Her face changed, she didn't yell, and she didn't cry. She just went quiet. The same quiet I remembered from the Sunday we ended things. The quiet that came over her right before she decided something was over. It was worse than anger would have been, because anger at least means someone is still fighting, and her quiet meant she was already measuring the distance between us. Evelyn started to explain, her voice careful and a little breathless, saying the bench was a commission, saying Daniel was helping, saying it was kind of him to take the work on. Charlotte held up one hand. Not rude, just firm, and she said she needed a minute. And she walked into the house and closed the screen door behind her. Every instinct I had told me to leave. I could make this easier for everyone by disappearing, by putting my tools in the truck, and driving away and letting them have a mother-daughter conversation I had no right to be part of. I was good at leaving after all. I'd practiced it with my marriage, and with Charlotte, and with most of the things in my life that asked me to stay when staying got hard. My feet carried me all the way to the truck, my hand on the door. Then I looked back at the house, and I saw Evelyn standing alone in the garden, under the oak, exactly where she'd been standing alone for 4 years, and something in me broke like the bench slat had broken, clean down the grain. I took my hand off the door, I put the keys back in my pocket, and I walked back toward the porch. Charlotte came back out after a few minutes, and the 3 of us sat on the porch in a row, which felt like the longest porch in the world right then. She was calm, but I could see the hurt working under her calm, like a current under still water. And I owed her the truth of everything, so I waited for her to lead. She asked the fair questions, the ones I'd have asked in her place. She asked why I hadn't told her, and whether this was the real reason she and I hadn't worked, and whether I was using her mother because she hadn't been enough for me. Each one landed. I didn't dodge a single one, because dodging was what had gotten me into this corner in the first place. I told her no, that she and I had ended because we didn't fit, 2 good people who wanted different shapes of life, and that her mother had nothing to do with that ending, and had never been the reason. I told her I hadn't said anything, because I hadn't known what this was yet myself, and because I'd been afraid, and that being afraid didn't excuse hiding it, and that I was sorry for the hiding more than for anything else. She sat with that for a moment, turning it over like I'd watched her turn things over her whole life, with a stillness that looked like calm from the outside, and was really just her deciding how honest she could afford to be. Then she said the thing that cut me cleanest. She said it wasn't me she was angry at. Not really, it was herself for not seeing how lonely her mother had gotten, and for calling less, and dropping by less, and letting her own busy life be the excuse. That was the part that made Evelyn's eyes go bright, because a daughter blaming herself for a mother's loneliness is the cruelest shape grief takes in a family that loves each other. Then Evelyn told Charlotte the truth, the whole of it. the years of being unseen and the radio left on in empty rooms, and how I'd looked at her like she mattered. She told it without dressing it up. I watched Charlotte's face change as she listened. Not all the way soft, but the hard edge in it began to bend. She said it was strange, and that it would take her time, and that she couldn't pretend it wasn't a shock to find her mother and her ex on the same porch. But she could see that her mother was less alone than she'd been in years, and she couldn't find it in herself to be angry about that, even if the shape of it wasn't what she'd expected. I said the thing out loud then that I'd only ever said inside my own head. I told them both that I'd been treating love like something I'd already used up, a ration I'd spent down to nothing and couldn't draw on again. What I wanted was to try, knowing it wouldn't be simple, and knowing the town would talk, and knowing Charlotte might never fully come around, and that I was done running from a thing just because staying was the harder choice. Charlotte stood up and kissed her mother on the cheek, and she looked at me for a long moment without smiling, but also without the quiet that had scared me earlier. She said she'd see us both later, and she walked to her truck and she drove off without slamming the door. She hadn't blessed it, and she hadn't forbidden it. The door she left behind her stayed open a crack, which was more than I'd had any right to hope for. I came back the next morning, early, while the mist was still on the garden, and I finished the bench. The last piece was the slat I'd carried in my pocket all those weeks, the broken one I'd kept, instead of throwing on the scrap pile. I fitted it into place, sanded it flush, and ran my hand along the whole seat to make sure there wasn't a single rough edge left for her to catch her palm on. Evelyn watched from the porch with her coffee, quiet, letting me have the work as she'd learned to let me have it. When it was done, I sat on the bench, under the oak, and I held out my hand the way I hadn't let myself hold it out the night of the storm. She came down the porch steps slow, and she took my hand, and she sat down beside me. And we didn't say anything grand. We just sat there, two people choosing the same quiet morning, the bench solid under us, and the oak moving above us in a wind we couldn't see. I thought then about how love at any age asks the same thing of a person, not perfection, not permission from everyone who has an opinion, just the courage to stay when it would be easier to walk. I'd spent 2 years practicing being alone, and she'd spent 4 years practicing being invisible. The only thing that had finally broken us both open was the willingness to be seen by one person and to see that one person back. Charlotte's acceptance is still growing, the way a garden grows back after a hard season, and the town will talk as towns always talk, and there will be days when the choice costs us more than we expected. We're choosing it anyway, sitting on a bench that was broken and is now sound, in a garden that is slowly being tended again, under an oak that was here before any of us, and will be here long after. If a second chance ever finds you in a place you weren't looking for it, I hope you have the courage to stay. I'd love to hear your story if you have one, so tell me in the comments. The bench is sound under us, the oak is still standing, and neither of us is invisible anymore.